can I first hear from you some of your first thoughts after having read Rushdie's introduction? Which book is this introduction a part of? Yes, yeah. It's an anthology that he edited along with Elizabeth West. Elizabeth West is an American writer and scholar. She was also at the time of this, when they were editing this together, she was also his partner. So this came out in 1997. This introduction was also published separately as an article in the journal New Yorker. It was in 1997. It had a different title. Damn, this is the Oriental scene for you. Yeah. So, but it really became a controversial issue only after this was part of the introduction to this anthology. And what was the title of the anthology? Vintage Book of Indian Writing, not Indian Writing in English. Vintage Book of Indian Writing, which is why many were also of the opinion if they had titled it a Vintage Book of Post-colonial Indian Writing in English, maybe there was no issue at all. Whatever he was saying would then fit in perfectly well with the selection that he had. His arguments will also begin to make sense. But the moment he begins to call it Indian literature, there is a problem with the arguments that he is trying to make. Yeah. So, do you want to quickly summarize this article for me, this introduction for me? What's the controversy over here? What does he say? You can just read out that passage. What's that outrageous remark that he makes about Indian writers working in English? And page number 10, second paragraph. Are you all there? This is it. The prose writing, both fiction and non-fiction, created in this period. This period is the 50 years of independence. In this period, by Indian writers working in English, is proving to be a stronger and more important body of work than most of what has been produced in the 16 official languages of India, the so-called vernacular languages, during the same time. And indeed, this new and still burgeoning Indo-Anglian literature represents perhaps the most valuable contribution India has yet made to the world of books. Yeah. So, among the many other things that he says, this is what was seen as very problematic, the dichotomy that he creates over here between Indian writers writing and working in English and the ones who have been writing in 16 official languages, as he puts it, the other vernacular languages. And then he goes on to say that if you make a comparison, whatever has been produced by the Indian writers in English, it holds more value than the sum total of what has been produced by the vernacular writers. Does this remind you of somebody else? This rhetoric? Macaulay. What did he say?
The entire wisdom of Orient can be fit into a single shelf.
Yeah. So he was also, Rushdie was also severely criticized for being very Orientalist in his reading of, in his analysis, in his devaluation of the vernacular writers. In this course, since we are looking at Indian English fiction, why do we have to begin with this introduction by Rushdie? Why didn't? Because is Rushdie a critic? No, not a renowned critic, not a renowned theorist. He's only a novelist, an A-league leading novelist for sure. But why do we begin with this? Because here in this article, he is writing this in the capacity of an editor. He, of course, in between he makes a few remarks about his own writing, justification for including his own writing. Yeah, but nevertheless, he is doing this. This write-up is in the capacity of an editor. And this was also a major theoretical and critical intervention in the field of Indian writing in English, not just in Indian fiction in English, in the field of Indian writing in English. This also came in at a very critical point, the late 1990s. Yeah, it was also a time, that decade, the 90s was, the 80s and the 90s in fact, were the decades when Indian writing in English made a comeback, as they say, because after the 1930s it was generally assumed that by the late 60s and 70s there were many who wrote about the death of Indian writing in English, because they thought there was a brief period of fruition, and now it's not fair to expect anything more. Yeah, because whatever little bit that they had to write in English, it's over and done with. Now we cannot make a mark and say again, make our presence felt. Indian writers in English, it was seen by the critics that they cannot make their presence felt again in the world literary map. And then Rushdie happens, Midnight Children happens. Yeah, there is a revival in Indian writing in English, and you know about the number of bookers that Indian writers in English, especially Rushdie, had been winning. Yeah, he won the Booker once, then he won the Booker of all Bookers. Yeah, and also of late, recently when they did this survey about the greatest work that has been ever been produced in terms of, if you take a survey of all the Booker Prize winners, again it was Rushdie. Yeah. So when Rushdie says this, it does have an impact. Yeah. And also when we talk about post-coloniality in the subcontinent, and also in a general sense, a number of theorists have used Rushdie as an entry point to talk about post-coloniality. So we cannot dismiss whatever he is saying, regardless of the kind of controversial comments that he had been making, regardless of how he totally runs out of favor with some of his own colleagues and also with his regional counterparts. It's impossible to disregard what he is saying, because this is seen as a critical intervention, because he is one of the major literary landmarks, which is also important in defining Indian writing in English. Yeah? And the other thing is that he is making this distinction very official over here, the distinction between Indian writers in English and the regional writers who are working in 16 official languages, as he puts it, or it could be the number could be more than that as well. Yeah. So this dichotomy, which has always already been there, the distinction between writers in English and the writers in other languages, Rushdie makes it more official over there, and he being a writer, it carries more, it carries a different import altogether. Yeah. He is certainly being very, very unkind to the regional writers. He is being very biased in many of his opinions, but nevertheless, this is an important moment, because after this we also see a number of other writers taking sides. Yeah. So it's not as if Rushdie alone is responsible for holding this, for maintaining this sort of an attitude. Yeah. Because if you look at the number of other writers, the number of other critics who came after him, in support of him, against him, we also begin to see maybe there were already two of these camps existing. Yeah. It just took Rushdie to stir the hornet's nest and get this controversy going. Yeah. And also there were also a couple of other anthologies which came out. Amit Chaudhary, he came up with this Picador anthology of Indian literature, and there he, though in not so many words, he said, I am going to kind of respond to Rushdie's anthology and set it all right. Yeah. So whatever biases which were part of Rushdie's anthology will be taken care of over here. Yeah. So there were a lot of critics and writers again making a comparison between Rushdie's and Chaudhary's anthology. So in multiple ways this is a landmark moment. So this is important for us to begin, say, in 1997 when Rushdie's work was published, this anthology was published, and then turn back and trace the chronology and the history and the ways in which Indian writing in English, particularly fiction, had been narrativized in history and criticism, and also in the as part of popular culture. And Rushdie, in addition, he also carries an additional, say, let's say, position. He is the whether we like him or not, whether we include him as a proper, legitimate Indian writer or not, he is the best known figure of Indian post-colonial writing in English. Yeah, he is almost like the iconic figure. He also talks about how people speak about this Rushdie-itis, yeah, which they developed after he started writing. A number of writers have also acknowledged that it's only because of Rushdie. Arundhati Roy, in one of her interviews, she says it's only because of Rushdie that we have been able to tell our own stories. Yeah? Because there is a way in which Rushdie made it possible for the Indian writers in English to tell their stories in connection with the nation, that too very legitimately, without feeling the burden of the colonial rule, without feeling, say, weighed down by these dichotomies between the colonial connection that English had vis-a-vis the legitimate native rootedness the regional languages had. He made it possible for them to, in a certain way, naturalize and Indianize English, because Rushdie's English, it's not as if he is not really endorsing the king's or the queen's English. Yeah, he has his own kind of English, a hybridity as they talk about. Yeah, he has his own kind of English that he experiments with. He uses a number of Indian words, and we also know that, if you're familiar with Arundhati Roy's writing, she does precisely that, and she takes it to another level altogether. So a number of writers have been extremely encouraged to write in particular ways without feeling the colonial burden, and Rushdie's English has also been seen as a chutnified language, yeah, because he does not. It's a very post-colonial Indian writing that he does. It's in fact, again coming back to the crux of this essay, for the same reason many have been very disillusioned that the very person who's written against authority, against authenticity, yeah, who's used hybridity, irony and mimicry in multiple ways, has in fact used the language of authenticity when he is writing this essay. Yeah. The languages of authenticity to say that, see, look at this, the set of Indian writing in English is more legitimate. Yeah. This is made a mark compared to the other writers, other writings available in regional languages. Yeah. So this essay, in that sense, it brings together these divergent elements. Rushdie as a writer challenging the colonial authority, challenging the legitimacy which was originally only part of the say the colonial modernity, and on the other hand Rushdie as an editor of this anthology talking about a different kind of authenticity which should be in place in order to privilege Indian writing in English over, say, other regional writings and other regional writers. Yeah. So, and here there's a way in which he situates when he tries to privilege Indian writing in English over vernacular languages. He uses, different tropes. He talks about what's this vice that he talks about, the vernacular writers. He says, something is the greatest vice of the parochialism. Yeah, he identifies parochialism as the greatest vice of the writers writing in vernacular languages. What's parochialism?
Narrow-mindedness.
Yeah. What could be the opposite? If you say, this writer is parochial. Otherwise, if the regional writers are parochial, then the Indian writers would be, writers in English would be what? Cosmopolitan, broad-minded, modern, parochialism. Think of the multiple words that could be associated with parochial. Yeah, narrow-mindedness, traditional. Yeah, in fact, he has even gone to the extent of talking at length about what he meant by parochial, and he even equated the writings of other writings by other vernacular writers to tractor art. That's a term he also borrows from Soviet. This term tractor art was used to refer to particular kinds of art forms and writings available in Soviet Union at one point of time. Yeah, so he uses the term tractor art, and then he's also very unapologetic about using this term parochial to talk about the Indian writers in other languages. Yeah, so according to him, the writers who are writing in regional languages, they are very traditional, very narrow-minded. They cannot rise up to such a level, yeah, that they can talk about cosmopolitan, broader things. On the other hand, he is also inherently implying that, look at us, yeah, Indian writers in English. Yeah, we are like the window to the world. We are more open. People can relate with us in a better way. Yeah, so he is very consciously building this barrier between Indian writers in English and other vernacular writers. Yeah, despite the shared ancestry that we can trace back to during the colonial modernity period. Yeah, and then he talks about, there's another thing that he brings in about the difference between translation and original. Yeah, English writing, we write it in the original, it's circulated in the original, but the Indian writings in other languages have to be translated. Yeah? And as Rushdie would put it, if the translation is bad, yeah, then you have there is no way in which you can make it to the global audience. Yeah? And translation also has got other inherent problems. So here, in fact, we find Rushdie also moving away from that post-colonial position of embracing other kinds of local, regional post-colonialities. Yeah? He becomes, automatically through this single stroke of writing this article, writing this introduction, he becomes the spokesperson of a cosmopolitan post-coloniality. Though, in his work, it has been multiple times, it has been analyzed that he is also the spokesperson of the local, the local and the regional multiple post-colonialities. And he is also completely dismissive of the kind of work that is coming out from, say, the regional writers. He is not even, and if you notice, he does not even spend enough time to dismiss them logically or in a systematic way. Yeah? With a single stroke, he is extremely dismissive. He is not even willing to discuss them at length because there is nothing over there. Yeah? So, this sort of an approach is also in a way alarming, because if Rushdie can be seen as the leading figure of Indian writers in English, if Rushdie is seen as the face, if you want to cull out just one figure out of all the Indian post-colonial writers, yeah, maybe the safest face would be Rushdie's. If he is this poster face of Indian post-colonial writing in English, and if this is the kind of view that is being endorsed by Rushdie, who ceases to be an individual, he is a representative. Yeah, of a kind of writing. He becomes a representative and the spokesperson of a particular kind of approach towards writing, then this is certainly an alarming thing. Yeah? And also, the some of the debates that followed, we shall be visiting those when we talk about, particularly about the post-colonial writings after Rushdie. And moving on, the other interesting thing is that though he talks about a number of writers whom he anthologizes in this literature, though he is also a part of this same set of writers, the same tradition, he does not really acknowledge his say his intellectual tradition, or he does not acknowledge his intellectual ancestry in any way. It's very interesting. In fact, who is the only person, he says, from whom he has learned a trick or two? G.V. Desani. And G.V. Desani, have you heard of his name before? G.V. Desani, in fact, he is seen as the perhaps the writer who became postmodern, yeah, even before postmodernism arrived. He wrote in the 1940s. His work is called All About H. Hatter. Yeah? All About H. Hatter, H-A-T-T-E-R-R. Yeah? And this work was resurrected only after Rushdie wrote this introduction. Yeah? So, this also reminds us about the canonizing power that Rushdie's anthology and his introduction has, because after Rushdie's anthology, this work, which he also mentions, it was out of print for a long time. Yeah, even now it's difficult to get hold of G.V. Desani's book. But after 1997, after Rushdie acknowledges his debt towards G.V. Desani, and also how he locates, Tristram Shandy. You've heard of Tristram Shandy, right? Yeah, it's also seen as very postmodern. Yeah, though it is an 18th century text. Yeah, so after this, you find a number of articles talking about G.V. Desani. You find at least a few university syllabi and curricula trying to include G.V. Desani. A lot of critical attention, books being churned out about how how you can find similarities across Desani and Rushdie. So, this is a canonizing power that Rushdie's anthology also has had. So, it's difficult not to look at it whether we agree with his points or not. Interestingly, Mehrotra also, maybe we will come back to discuss Mehrotra in detail in the next class, but Mehrotra also talks about how Desani becomes important, because Rushdie says Alan Seeley's Tottenham would have been impossible. It would not have happened if G.V. Desani had not written before that. Yeah? So, this sort of connections that Rushdie makes, whether we like the logic behind it or not, it gets accepted. Yeah? And which again, it's not something that we can really complain about and quarrel with, because this is the way canons are getting created. This is the way particular kinds of modes of legitimacy, it's at work, so on and so forth. Yeah? And he also here, even if we talk about the inclusion and exclusion policy that Rushdie and the West adopt as a as an editor? Do they give us any sense of how they use the criteria? Yeah. They only talk about all kinds of anthologies may have different kinds of things that they use, and we also have used our own thing. We have used our extensive knowledge, our reading based on that. Other than that, we do not get a sense of the aesthetic criteria or the theoretical criteria or the critical criteria that they are using as a policy for inclusion or exclusion. And this lack of criteria, we need not in fact find problem with it, but it becomes a problem only when he begins to also assume the status of an evaluator, a judge. This is better than that, yeah, because he does not talk about a criteria in the first place, and his aesthetic preferences, what are the basis of that also we do not get to know about. Yeah. And this also would not have been a problem if under Indian literature he had perhaps included a number of other languages. Yeah. If you look at his selection, yeah, could you take a look at the kind of text that he has included in this work? Yeah. It's mostly written originally in English. Yeah. And other than that, he has only included a couple of texts which includes Toba Tek Singh. Yeah. So, other than that, he does not really engage. It looks as if he is not even engaged with the other forms of writing available in languages other than English. Yeah. And there is a mistrust that the reader would have with this anthology right from the beginning, because we do not know what the aesthetic criteria is, and we do not know on the basis of what critical attitude he is making these comments, he is making these judgments. We are totally at a loss. But on the other hand, he also successfully manages to sort of insert a wedge between Indian writers working in English and the others. He does not even, maybe occasionally he names a few who could have been great writers. Yeah. But again, due to various reasons which he does not really specify or engage with, they have not made remember the phrase that he uses in the beginning, they have not made the final cut. Yeah. So, here he is also assuming the position of power and authority as if by virtue of being a well-known Indian writer in English, he also has the power to decide who makes the final cut and who does not make the final cut. Yeah. So, here and in fact, if you think about different kinds of anthologies, different kinds of things which are being included or excluded from particular anthologies, we may or may not have problems with this, with those sort of inclusions and exclusions. But here, because of the position that Rushdie assumes, because of the authority that he has as a post-colonial writer in even changing the paradigms of critical discussion, yeah, this is extremely important. This intervention that he makes, it does have a it does have a consequence, it does have a bearing on how others write, how particular kinds of writers and writings are included, excluded, so on and so forth. And these issues, in fact, very interestingly, the issues that knowingly or unknowingly Rushdie talks about, they are also an inherent part of the history of Indian writing in English. If you look at Mehrotra's work, which we will not be doing in detail right now, in the section, if you notice, the introduction, Mehrotra's introduction is also divided in different sections. He has got altogether 5 sections. In the section 3 and 4, in the section 3, he talks exclusively about language issues, yeah, which is what Rushdie also problematizes in a different way altogether. And Mehrotra talks about how there was always this dichotomy about, again, this issue of language, Mehrotra says, was also associated with questions of loyalty, questions of nationalism. Yeah, whether you are a party of, whether you owe your allegiance to, whether your allegiance is to the nationalist movement or to the colonial ruler, was also decided on the basis of the language in which you chose to write. Yeah, he talks about how Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay also believed that he had to write in Bangla to prove his nationalist loyalty. He also dissuaded others who were writing in English. Yeah, and in the same way, in section 4, he talks about, Mehrotra talks about the animosity against Indian writers in English, because English has also been associated with a number of other things. English as a language of power, English related to certain kind of eliteness, about particular kinds of social status that you enjoy in society. And Rushdie, in fact, here we can see that Rushdie is not perhaps addressing these things in isolation. Maybe he is also responding to a lot of things which were building up from, say, early 19th century onwards, from the time Indians started writing in English. Yeah? And maybe for the same reason, many of the things that Rushdie talks about, it also went down well with at least some of the Indian writers in English. At least some of them, though not very openly, they have at various points through interviews, through the snippets of conversations that they shared during lit festivals, during the promotional events. They all have, in some form or the other, they have declared their allegiance to Rushdie vis-a-vis the authors, the others writing in the Indians writing in other languages. When we talk about Rushdie's introduction and the kind of issues that he raises over here, though in a controversial manner, you would continue to see that even in the discussions of say individual works, the critical analysis of individual works, the framework within which particular issues within Indian writing in English is located, these issues come time and again about the eliteness of Indian writers in English vis-a-vis the the traditional low profile status that the writers in vernacular literatures are forced to occupy. In fact, there was another controversy in between about the Stephanian writers. Yeah? It was about whether there is a Stephanian school of writing or not, because there are a number of these Indian writers in English who were also products of St. Stephen's College. Yeah? Shashi Tharoor, Amitabh Ghosh, Alan Seeley, yeah, Vikram Seth, they all went to, there is a pattern of education which could be traced. They went to one of those public schools like Doon School, and then to St. Stephen's, and then to Oxbridge. Yeah? And in between, in one of the interviews or in one of the newspaper articles, Arundhati Roy remarked that I am not part of those old boys club. Yeah? So I don't live abroad. I didn't go to any of these places either. Yeah? So there was this a few then one of the critics wrote about an entire book about the Stephanian writers. Yeah? And Shashi Tharoor came up and said it cannot be called as a Stephanian school of writing, because it's not as if they all came together to write particular kinds of works, but nevertheless they also defended that only if you went to Stephen's, these sort of writings could be produced. Yeah? Say a work like, are you familiar with English August? Upamanyu Chatterjee? Upamanyu Chatterjee, right? Yeah, Upamanyu Chatterjee's English August. Yeah? So they all felt that if someone who's not had that kind of education, someone who's not had that sort of a cosmopolitan exposure, could not have written that kind of a book. Yeah? So those were also at some level we find that all of those approaches, all of those belief systems and worldviews are also quite, it sits very well with what Rushdie talks about. Yeah? We are more cosmopolitan. Yeah? We look at the world. Yeah? Look at you. Yeah? And also in that interview where he spoke about the vernacular literatures being quite akin to tractor art, he talks about how still in the vernacular fiction they are still talking about about patriarchy, about how women are sidelined, the women do not have a voice. He talks about how the vernacular literature still talks about everything traditional. They find it difficult to come out of that. So here we also get a sense that these writers who are working in English are completely unaware of the various sorts of revolutions and rebellions and forms of post-colonial protests that are happening within vernacular fiction. So he is trying to reiterate the fact that maybe nation is not the biggest thing. There are other bigger things than the nation, such as gender, caste, issues related to communalism. So the regional writers are busy engaging with all of these pressing issues which are like more, which has got more relevance than the issues which are happening at the national level. Yeah. So, keeping that aside, yeah, there is one article which came out in 2004 which critiques this. It is by S. Shankar, which critiques this this attitude of Rushdie in a very succinct way. He says that what came out of this entire article was that it suggests the backwardness of Rushdie's own approach. Yeah. So, there are a lot of other regional writers also who share the same opinion, that Rushdie, in spite of this sort of cosmopolitan approach and the vast exposure that he has had, and the irony and the hybridity that he could incorporate into his own writings, into his own novelistic enterprises, he's come out as a very backward critic who's not been able to accept different pluralities, the multiplicities, and the different kinds of narrativizations as as we think he'd been doing in a number of his works. So, in a sense, when we try to look at the look at Rushdie's essay, either in isolation or as a corollary to the many literary historical approaches that we shall be taking a look at, it's important to come back to Rushdie's essay and look at the sense of history that this introduction is giving us, because this introduction it's also it's primarily meant for a Western audience, for the Western academies, for the Western readers. Yeah. So, what's the sense of history that in 1997 Rushdie is trying to give to his audience, yeah, about Indian writing in English? Yeah, because though in the other multiple histories that we shall be taking a look at, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra's or M.K. Naik's or Srinivas Iyengar's, they all emphasize on this shared history, the shared intellectual trajectory that Indian writers in English as well as the writers in vernacular languages had. Yeah. And Bankim Chandra Chatterjee is an example. Derozio is a different kind of an example. Yeah. So, they all were part of the same kind of nationalist movement. They all engaged with similar struggles as part of the transition which was going on during the period of colonial modernity. But Rushdie's work, again, when we come back to this and look at it, it's a little dismissive of this history. The approach that Rushdie takes towards in situating Indian writing in English in a historical paradigm is very different. Yeah, again G.V. Desani's example also comes up, because he does not talk about the phase that Indian writers in English or Indian literature as such went through during the colonial modernity. He does not give us that, he does not talk about that part of history at all. Instead, it's very fluid, very elusive, yeah, very non-committal, yeah, and also does not, we do not know whether deliberately or inadvertently, does not acknowledge his this trajectory, does not acknowledge how he has been part of this particular trajectory, which he also seeks to trace by giving a chronological account of a number of writers through this anthology. Is there anything that you want to add to this? There was also an article which came out in the Outlook magazine. I don't know if I have given this as part of your course material. It was called Midnight's Orphans, because in connection with the post-colonial Indian writing being seen as Midnight's children. Yeah, again taking off from Rushdie's own work. Yeah, so this article in I think it was in Outlook. If you Google it, you can find it. I can also send you the link. It talks about how the regional writers also in this process became Midnight's orphans. Yeah? Because in this process, initially, when Mehrotra also, when he is tracing this history of Indian writing in English, he talks about a shared history. But in the post-colonial world, particularly after the 80s and 90s, we get to know that there is the entire paradigm shifts, yeah, due to various reasons, including the cosmopolitanism, globalization, yeah, and all kinds of things which happened after the 1990s. Precisely the scene which Rushdie presents to you, this is the Oriental scene for you. It actually holds true, because Due to this paradigm shift, due to the shift in the market conditions, due to this shift in the forms of governance, for ways in which you receive texts, how circulate texts, how texts are being popularized, publicized, everything has changed. So, now we find that Indian writers in English, they have become the they have become the legitimate inheritors of this post-colonial narrative, and the writers in regional languages, writers in the vernacular languages, they are being forced to occupy a sidelined, a marginalized position. So, this article in Outlook, it also refers to them as being the Midnight's orphans. It also has a number of interviews with the other regional writers, a number of NPTEL awardees and all, responding to how what they think about Rushdie's charges of parochialism, of Indian writing in English having more say output, quality output compared to the others. And we'll also go through some of the things that Rushdie talks about, which we also agree with in certain sense. He talks about, and come to page 16, the section which ends over there after he talks about Rushdie-itis and all. As an individual, Hindi, Urdu, the Hindustani of North India remains an essential aspect of my sense of self. As a writer, I have been partly formed by the presence in my head of that other music, the rhythms, patterns and habits of thought and metaphor of my Indian tongues. What I am saying is that there is not, need not be, should not be an adversarial relationship between English language literature and the other literatures of India. We drink from the same well. India, that inexhaustible horn of plenty, nourishes us all. Yeah. So, we it's also evident that we do not even know whether he really means it or this just plain rhetoric, but this similar thing has been dealt with in a more serious, systematic way by a number of literary historians. There is something that I wanted to keep in mind when you also do the analysis of individual works, that also in some form we can take off from this essay, the previous page, in page 15, the way he talks about the writers who have homes outside of India, and he also refers to them as wanderers. Yeah. So, remember in the first session we spoke about how after colonial modernity, these two different sets of writers, writers working in English and the writers writing in regional languages. Yeah. One set was seen to be like traveling, wandering, seeing the world. The other set of writers, the regional writers, they were equated with this idea of staying home and writing. Yeah. So, this thing, and one was modern, the other was traditional, one was cosmopolitan and the other was parochial. Yeah. And here in page 15, in that paragraph, if we take a look at those set of writers that he talks about, whom he also perhaps identifies with Indian writers in English, all those the iconic figures of world literature, Graham Greene, Anthony Burgess, James Joyce, Samuel Beckett, Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, Doris Lessing. Yeah. And the list goes on, Borges, Nabokov, Muriel Spark, where or are wanderers. Yeah. So, he talks about maybe people like him as well, and equates Indian writers in English who do not have a home in the traditional sense, just like the writers in vernacular or regional languages have. We are wanderers. So, in some sense he is also equating Indian writing in English with the status of world literature, with the status of more international literature compared to the more inward looking, according to him, inward looking parochial writings of vernacular writers. Also about this point about Rushdie not acknowledging his intellectual ancestors. In Mehrotra's introduction, he also draws our attention to how this set of writing, the Indian writers in English, they generally do not acknowledge each other. Yeah? It is as if the only exception has been when a number of writers have acknowledged Rushdie. Otherwise, because Rushdie enabled them to write in a very post-colonial way, experimenting with language, experimenting with narratives of the nation, etc. Otherwise, Mehrotra also draws our attention to how we do not find these writers acknowledging each other, except for one or two instances that he talks about. One is, Alan Seeley acknowledging Derozio as his literary forebear, that he made it possible for people like him to write. Otherwise, there are very, very few instances of writers referring to each other, even acknowledging each other's presence, though they all share the same literary canvas. This is something very peculiar that you would continue to note. Each writer, we also get this feeling that they write in isolation, targeting perhaps a world audience whom we do not even say know for sure. And for the same reason, a number of critics, it's not something very novel that Mehrotra is pointing out. In a number of criticisms of all of these leading writers, it has been pointed out multiple times. This they all exist like islands and write about, interestingly, rather similar kind of things. Even the Stephanians, when certain critics were trying to point out the kind of similarities that they had, these writers who were also Stephanians were also quick to reject that claim and say there is hardly anything similar. Perhaps we all share the same sort of background, and that's getting reflected. Other than that, there is an unwillingness to to engage with this visible similarities or whatsoever. Next session we will come back to take a look at Mehrotra's introduction. This is more, in fact this is this literary history, it devotes a separate chapter for each writer or each phase that he thinks is quite representative. Like sometimes it will be for an individual writer, or sometimes it will be for an entire period, like writers of the 30s, of the 40s. It's a fairly exhaustive literary history that Mehrotra presents, and in his introduction he also gives a rather non-judgmental trajectory of events from the beginning. And also he also the narrative also is very interesting. He locates the starting point at 1800 and tells us the various reasons for that. He also incorporates the story of Indian writing in English and narrates it alongside the story of the nation, because and also there is an impossibility again to narrate the story of Indian writing in English without talking about the nation. And also Ranjini, I was thinking about this question that you raised yesterday, like when we did literary history, we spoke about how all literary histories are autobiographies of the nation. So what is so peculiar about this? So I think one way in which Indian fiction, we find it very unique in the sense that almost every single work, we are not talking about the literary history, the novels which are being produced, almost every single work is engaging with the nation. We do, maybe if you try and do a survey of the canonical works, they all have got something to do with the nation or not. And there is also one essay which we shall be doing as part of the course, where Josna Regge talks about how women had been neglected in particular ways, maybe because they are not talking about the nation. You think about who are the women writers in Indian writing in English? Anita Desai, Kamala Markandeya. If you are even vaguely familiar with their works, it concerns with issues of women, domesticity, family, and you come to the big league of writers, Rushdie, Vikram Seth, Amitav Ghosh. They are dealing with subjects of which really demand a lot of seriousness and a lot of gravitas. It's about the nation, it's about partition, it's about the post-colonial condition. And you survey any of these canonical writers who are these big names in Indian writing in English, they are all talking about the nation. So in fact, Arundhati Roy's work which does not in that sense directly engage with the nation. It was a very, it set a different paradigm altogether. But even then, if you look at the critical material, yeah, there's a way in which Arundhati's work also, novel is also been appropriated into the narrative of the nation, yeah, retelling of the nation, right. So, maybe in one way in which the Indian English novel stands out as unique compared to the novels being produced in a number of other languages in India, is that they are still, in the beginning, in the 1930s, they were writing about the nation. In the 1990s, they are still writing about the nation, yeah, in different ways. Yeah. Maybe the mode of narration has changed, but you look at regional fiction, yeah, in your own mother tongues, you know, in your mind, run through the handful of novels that you are familiar with. Yeah. Look at the range of issues that they engage with. It is not always about a particular community, it is not always about nation, it is not always about the big events that concern the nation, it is also about individuals. Yeah. Here, you know, because Midnight Children, it is certainly a story of two individuals, but the story of those two individuals, it becomes important because it is narrated against the backdrop of the nation. Shadow Lines, again, yeah, it is narrated by, it is a child narrator, it is about his family, the people whom he comes across, but that becomes important because of the shadow line of partition, and the stories are being projected because the partition happened. He is not, you know, 1947 partition, whatever happens later in Bengal. Yeah. So, there is a backdrop of these mega national events in most of the works that assume this canonical status. This has also been, you know, the nation theme also has been worked and overworked, and maybe one of the interesting projects that you can think of for your presentation, for your assignment is, you know, how to get out of this trap of nation. Yeah. And writing, and in Rushdie's introduction, if you note, you know, he talks about writing nationalistically in a very derogatory sense. Yeah. So, writing nationalistically is different from writing about the nation. Yeah. Nationalistic is seen more or less like, you know, very parochial, only talking about things that are you know, your own, yeah, that are your immediate concern. Yeah. So, so do not get these two things confused about writing about the nation and about writing nationalistically. If you have already read through Mehrotra's thing, you know, go through that again. And also one thing if you could do, you know, for each section, if you could just highlight some of the major points that you note in terms of, you know, you do not have to go into the details of, you know, the dates and things such that, the major issues that he talks about, just like, you know, in section 3 and 4, the highlight is, you know, the language issue, and then in section 4 it comes to say the kind of animosity people had against Indian writing in English. So, in that sense, if you could note down certain points, it will be easy for us to compile them and discuss over here. That is all we have for today. Thank you.